Do we need a do-over?
Hi, my name is Adam Hamilton. I'm a pastor and the author of Half-Truths, and I'm so grateful that you're joining us today for this study as we contemplate and consider things that Christians often say to one another that may not be entirely true. And we might challenge you just a little bit, and there'll be some of these half-truths you'll say, wait a minute, I'm still convinced that's entirely true, and that's okay. But I want to invite you at least to think about these things. Now, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee with a group of seminary students from Vanderbilt Divinity School and pastors and a few staff members from churches here in Nashville. We're at Thistle Farms Cafe, a really great place and a great ministry, and we're going to be sharing together over these next 5 weeks these half-truths. And I wanted to mention up front what the half-truths are that we're going to be talking about. Everything happens for a reason. We're going to start with this one. God helps those who help themselves. God won't give you more than you can handle. God said it. I believe it. That settles it. And love the sinner and hate the sin. And these are things that we've probably all said at some point or another. How many of you have actually said one of these things or more at some point? You can raise your hands. It's okay. I have too. And I'd ask those of you, who are watching at home, you've probably said them as well. Some of you say, wait a minute, what's wrong with that particular statement? And we're going to ponder that together and just see the truth in these half-truths, and then why we might want to banish these from our theological vocabulary in the future.
So I didn't see any hands raised. How many of you, first of all, have heard these phrases, right? How many have actually said them? Yes. How many have heard them from other people toward you? Yes. Okay. That's why we're looking at these, because all of these phrases have become now a part of our vernacular in our culture, right? Our conversations with one another. These are cliches almost. We say them so often. And we don't always think about what it is we're saying when we say these things. We all have good intentions, right? Where are you when you hear these kinds of things? When you hear these phrases, or when you've said them, what are you trying to do? Okay, trite. Yeah, it sounds trite. But what's the situation that causes you to say this? What? Struggle, pain, grief, right? And so we want to be that caring, concerning person, right? We want to be the person that cares and that reaches out to help. And sometimes we don't always know what to say. Sometimes things are unexplainable. Sometimes things are so bad, there are no words, right? We don't know what to say. What would we have said had we been there at that nightclub when the people came in and opened fire? We don't always know what to say. And so that's when these phrases come out, because they're so much a part of our conversation with one another that we just fall back on those because we don't know what to say, and we don't always trust that the Spirit's with us, helping us in those situations. And so we fall back on these phrases. And so I'm saying and encouraging us and challenging us, along with Adam Hamilton, to start paying attention to the phrases that we say. Most of the time we think, well, the ministry of presence is more important than what we actually say in those times. Very true. Very, very true. But what you say matters too. And sometimes it's better not to say anything at all. There are lots of situations where there are no words. There's nothing that can be done to explain the situation. There is absolutely nothing you can do to fix the situation. There is no one to blame, including God. So what do? You hold a hand. You give a hug. You sit down and you cry alongside. That ministry of presence is so important. But not saying something that you might regret later. It's easier to say nothing. Do that when you don't know. Trust that the Spirit is there communicating in a hug. Because you don't want the unintended consequence of making that person that you're trying to help feel worse about their situation than they did before you got there. And some of these half-truths actually do that. So that's why we're taking the time to examine them, to intentionally care about what we say and think about what we say. Have you ever heard that phrase from Inherit the Wind, the quote that says, do you ever think about the things you think about? Remember that quote from that? We need to intentionally think about the things we think about and the things we say to one another. And that's what this series is attempting to do. Adam Hamilton is the senior pastor at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. It's in Leawood, Kansas, which is just outside of Kansas City. He's written all kinds of books. He's amazing. He's written this Half-Truths books that we're going to be following throughout this series. And his congregation is going through a lot of the same expansion, growth kind of pains that we're going through ourselves this summer. Theirs is on a little bit different scale than ours. They have 19,000 members in their congregation, and their new building project is $90 million. So, aren't you glad you're here? But it's really an amazing ministry. They've done all kinds of things to connect with each other and with the communities that they serve, and they've been a true leader for folks like us to be able to stop and think about things intentionally. Adam Hamilton will help us walk through this, through these 5 weeks. We have DVDs for the small groups, we have leaders' guides, we have all kinds of things. So not only can we have the conversation here, but we can have them in small groups with one another and open that conversation a little bit wider and go a little bit deeper. And Adam helps us do that. Along with this, one of the things we'd like for you to experience within this series is that there are way more than 5 half-truths. Adam Hamilton talks in his book about the fact that he had a really long struggle with narrowing down hundreds of half-truths down to the 5 that he chose to discuss in his book. And so my challenge to all of you is to stop and think about things that you've either said yourself and wish you hadn't have, or thought about it differently later, or things that other people have said to you in the midst of a time when you were in struggle that really wasn't very helpful. Usually we explain those things away or just blow them off because we're thinking that, the people are kind, they love us, they want to help us, they meant well, right? But we've all been there. We've all had those conversations with people where they try to help us, but it wasn't really that comforting. And in fact, many times it backfired and made us feel worse. So we're going to collect these things in the board, and we'll report those as we go. And then at the end, we'll have a whole collection that we can really, truly examine in order to try to get better at saying exactly what we mean and mean what we say. Okay? John 8 is the text that I chose to talk about truth. It is Jesus saying to us, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. He's not talking about a half-truth here. He's talking about being called to seek the whole truth, right? He's calling us to be about acting in creation, participating in the movement together toward good. How do we do that? How do we follow Jesus into seeking that whole truth? How do we act wholeheartedly in our living with one another rather than halfway? Jesus calls us to be attentive to one another, to pay attention to one another, to actually listen and speak with one another, to listen specifically for those needs that we all have, and then actively, intentionally be a part of helping address those needs with one another. About 20 years ago, I was faced with surgery for a tumor on my optical nerve. My children were 5 and 7. And I was wondering a lot at the time whether or not I was literally going to be able to see them grow up. I might be alive, but would I see them? Could I see their faces as they changed, as they grew? And my congregation at the time, it wasn't mine, it was my husband's, but I was a big part of it. They were actively working with me, trying to comfort me. They would come over and they'd bring their casseroles, which was fabulous because I don't cook. So really nothing changed there. But they were there in prayer and in spirit, and they were a huge support. But during that whole time, I heard that phrase, everything happens for a reason. And I got to tell you, what was meant for comfort, God's in control, God has this, don't worry about things, things will be good, actually terrified me. Far from comforting me, the thought that God was in control and causing this tumor in my eye was not a comforting thought. I'm not sure I want to know a God that causes things like this to happen, that would cause me to lose my eyesight just so I could learn a lesson? Or maybe be part of some master plan that I have no say in or no understanding of? That terrified me. It was not comforting. So even when you think no one's listening at those times, they really are. And it backfires much of the time. And that's not your intention. Thankfully, I'm married to a pastor. And he had different ideas about who God is and how God relates to us and how we relate to God. And the message I heard from him was not that God caused that tumor in my brain, but that rather God is with me in my fear of that tumor in my brain. So when I'm facing surgery with 2 little kids that I have to say goodbye to, I can trust that God's there with me. It doesn't make it go away, but there's strength there. There's courage there. And there's care there. That's comfort. That's what we intend. That is what we intend when we say everything happens for a reason, right? We're not blaming the victim here. What we're doing is blaming God, right? God's the one that's in control. But what we're really trying to say is God is with you. That presence of God is with you always. And that's a whole different thing. So how can we make sure that that's what we get across rather than something that terrifies the person? It's hard to do. Because this caring and concern of God's presence sometimes doesn't always seem enough. But it is. Coming from experience, I would much rather hear that than God has a plan and you got screwed in it. Right? I don't want to know that. Harold Kushner is a rabbi that wrote the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Right? The book was always misnamed. As far as I can remember, it was written in the 70s. I always thought the name of the book was Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And the book was not about why things happen. The book was when bad things happen. They will happen. How do we respond? And how is God present in that with us? That's the real question. And that's what this half-truth doesn't really address. It's trying to explain the unexplainable, the why of things, and the inevitability of bad things happening. And there are lots of thoughts about that. But the care and the concern that we give each other in the name of God is our response, is our nurturing, caring self that God gives us to be with one another. And that's what we're called to be about. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist monk who is kind of the main person behind the mindfulness movement. out there. He wrote a book called Going Home, Jesus and Buddha as Brothers. And he talks about this relationship that we have with God, because I believe that behind this half-truth is that understanding about who God is and how we are related. So to understand that spiritual relationship that's there in creation is very important for us to understand how we might live into the whole truth of this statement and live wholeheartedly in life. So it's kind of a long reading. I'm going to ask you to just kind of sit back, close your eyes. It's about waves and water and their relationship. Just literally let it wave over you as you hear it. And perhaps you'll experience something about that relationship with God.
Let us visualize the ocean with a multitude of waves. Imagine that we are a wave on the ocean, and surrounding us are many, many waves. If the wave looks deeply within herself, she will realize that her being there depends on the presence of all the other waves. Her coming up, her going down, and her being big or small depend entirely on how the other waves are. Looking into yourself, you touch the whole. You touch everything. You are conditioned by what is there around you. In the teaching of the Buddha, we learn that this is because that is. This is like this because that is like that. It is a very simple teaching, but very deep. Because the other waves are, this wave is. Because the other waves are like that, this wave is like this. Touching yourself, you touch the whole. When you are capable of touching yourself deeply and touching others deeply, you touch the other dimension, the dimension of the ultimate reality. A wave is made of other waves. You can discover the relationship between that wave and all the other waves with the principle of cause and effect. But there is another level of relationship, and that is the relationship between the wave and the water. The wave is aware that she is made of the other waves, and at the same time, she realizes that she is made of water too. It is very important for her to touch the water, the foundation of her being. She realizes that all the other waves are also made of water. In Buddhism, we speak of the world of phenomenon, dharma lakshana. You, me, the birds, the trees, squirrels, the creek, the air, the stars, are all phenomena. There is a relationship between one phenomenon and another. If we observe things deeply, we will discover that one thing contains all the other things. If you look deeply into a tree, you will discover that a tree is not only a tree. It is also a person. It is a cloud. It is the sunshine. It is the earth. It is the animals and the minerals. The practice of looking deeply reveals to us that one thing is made up of all other things. One thing contains the whole cosmos. When we hold a piece of bread to eat, if mindfulness is there, if the Holy Spirit is there, we can eat the bread in a way that will allow us to touch the whole cosmos deeply. A piece of bread contains the sunshine. That is not something difficult to see. Without sunshine, the piece of bread cannot be. A piece of bread contains a cloud. Without a cloud, the wheat cannot grow. So when you eat the piece of bread, you eat the cloud, you eat the sunshine, you eat the minerals, time, space, everything. One thing contains everything. With the energy of mindfulness, we can see deeply. With the Holy Spirit, we can see deeply. Mindfulness is the energy of the Buddha. The Holy Spirit is the energy of God. They both have the capacity to make us present, fully alive, deeply understanding, and loving. That is why in our daily life, we should live mindfully. We should live with the Holy Spirit so we can live every moment of our daily life deeply. If we do not live each moment deeply, there is no way we can touch the ultimate dimension, the dimension of the noumena. It seems as though the wave and the water are two different things, but in fact, they are one. Without water, there would be no wave. And if we remove the wave, there is no water. There are two levels and two kinds of relationships. When we speak of cause and effect, we have to be aware on what level we are speaking. Is it on the level of phenomena or the level of noumena? It is very important not to mix up the two.
So we live in a cause and effect world, right? Much of what we do, our legislation, our scientific method, a lot of that stuff is all based on that whole principle of cause and effect. But there is a relationship that transcends that a bit, that he talks about in that conversation on wave and water. That there are two levels of relationship. And when we talk about our relationship with God, our relatedness to God, we are talking about that second level of relationship, that one where we are in God and God is in us, that God created all things and placed all things, including us, in time and in history, and that we are all a part of that and integrated and interrelated in all of that. But by placing creation in time and in history, that doesn't necessarily mean that God then continually controls and determines that creation. What it does mean is that God is continually active in it. But God can be active and present in a situation without determining its outcome. And I think when we say everything happens for a reason, we assume that God is determining the outcome, when what we really mean to say is that God is present in the activity of the situation. And that's what we mean when we say that this is a half-truth. Kind of leads us there, but then it veers off and misses the point almost altogether. So when we're in this creation, we're not only just a part of it. We are called to be co-creators with God in this. How many of you remember the story in Genesis where Adam is called to actually name the animals? Do you remember that? And then in that, you know, in the whole Jewish understanding, the whole Hebrew tradition, naming something means calling it into being. When you actually breathe the name, you breathe life into it and bring it into life. So Adam was co-creating with God in that. And humanity was given dominion over creation in that setting, right? So what does dominion actually mean? Does it mean we get to just do whatever we want and say how things go and that's just the way it is? Literally, dominion means being responsible for something else. Caring for something else. Not having power over it, but being responsible for it. Nurturing it. Caring for it. Literally, God is trusting humanity with creation. How are we doing on that? That's a huge level of trust in that relatedness, right? We're not just a part of creation, we're caretakers for it. We co-create with God. We have a responsibility for it. And when we're not following Jesus into the whole truth of things, when we're not being the proper stewards of creation that we have been called to be in creation, bad things happen. It may not fully explain why bad things happen, but there are consequences. God is not controlling things. God sets boundaries around existence. God hopes and dreams and desires for us to choose life in the midst of those boundaries. But when we don't, bad things happen. Consequences are inevitable. People walk into nightclubs and massacre people. I just found out about that before I walked in here today, and it's just boggling my mind. Whole boatloads of people have to run from their homes, risking the lives of their children to do so in order to give them life. Brutal violence in war. Brutal ravaging of our planet. Innocent children being abused. Lots of bad things are happening, right? But when they happen, we are asked to respond in a way that chooses life, not a way that dismisses our responsibility toward it, or blames God, or expects God to fix everything. In Deuteronomy, it says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days. To live wholeheartedly means to choose life. To choose the love that you were created in. To desire God and the boundaries fixed around creation so that all may have life abundantly. God sets those boundaries and hopes we live in them abundantly. But God does not determine that. We decide to choose life. We are the ones that can make the difference in much of the pain that's out there. So when unexpected things get thrown at us and we have no idea what's really happened, it seems so random. Last week in Eric's sermon, we realized the strange attractor actually has a pattern to it, even though we don't see it. But after thousands of iterations, that strange attractor becomes a pattern. We don't see it right away, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And it doesn't mean that God has a plan that we have to somehow fit into it. It means that we are all interconnected even though we don't always realize it, and that we are responsible for one another. So instead of answering unexplained phenomena or mysteries of why bad things happen to good people, we don't respond with things like, well, everything happens for a reason, God will fix it. Or God caused it, so it must be okay. Let's respond instead with ways that we can creatively steward the world, where we can intentionally listen to one another and care for one another in a way that minimalizes those bad things that happen, that cares for the earth in a way that the earth can then care for us. That's living wholeheartedly instead of just getting by. That's the whole truth that we're called to be about, not a half-truth. That's what we're called to be about. So as we listen for music in the next minute or so, I ask you to think, they say everything happens for a reason. How might I rethink that now? How do I understand the will of God when it comes to bad things? How might we respond in a different way?
Today's scripture from the book of Romans. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn within a large family. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified.
So how might we choose life, as Deuteronomy calls us to do? We participate in what God's already doing. We trust in the creation and the Creator, right? We trust that God is here, active in all that we do and say, not controlling, not determining, but predetermining. Literally, the pre in that matters, right? Predestination is not a determined outcome. That would be post. Pre means before. In creation, God gave us what we needed to live abundantly. and promised to be with us throughout. We are set up to succeed. So how do we choose to live? We watch and we listen and we intentionally seek those places and spaces where God is already moving in the world. And we choose to participate in that activity as co-creators, helping to bring life into its fullness instead of resting on our laurels and letting God take care of things. We are called to be that in creation. And to deny that is to deny our responsibility for it. It also means denying the care and the comfort of the person that is sitting right in front of you asking for help. To be co-creators takes seriously who we are as God's image in the world. Everything happens for a reason? Perhaps. Not if it means that God's in control and causes things, but what happens if you think of that word reason as us? What if we're the reason? What if in creation we were given dominion to care, to participate, to name, and to nurture? Guess what? We were. To make this a whole truth, all we have to do is see that the reason is us. God cares for us, loves us, created us to nurture one another and all of creation. Everything happens for a reason if the reason is us. Not that we're the point of creation, but we might be our own answers to our prayers. Memes that float around Facebook. How many know what a meme is? It's kind of like a quote that's out there with cute pictures, right? When I got everything happens for a reason as the one I was going to preach on this morning, I automatically thought of this meme. Everything happens for a reason, but sometimes the reason is you're stupid and you make bad decisions. A little demeaning, I agree, but it literally turns this half-truth on its ear, doesn't it? It stops us from blaming God and saying that God is causing all things or that God is going to fix all things so we don't have to worry about it. And rather instead claims what it means to be co-creator, claims our own responsibility in creating with God and participating in the activity that God is already about in the world. It's a great thing to remember. And that many of the things that we find that stand in our way of that relationship with God are things we actually choose to let happen. We're responsible for it. We make bad decisions. Consequences are inevitable in that. So how can we work together to minimalize that? How do we know what our calling is? We not only listen to one another, we listen to God. How many have seen this meme from Pope Francis? You pray for the hungry, then you feed them. That is how prayer works. When we're intentionally listening, we're already considering whatever actions we need to be a part of the answer for the prayer that we're praying. If we're only praying for the people and for God to solve things, then we're only half-heartedly participating. But if we ask in our prayers not only that these people be comforted and nurtured, but that we actively become a part of that care and that nurture for the other. One or the other is only half-hearted. Prayer is not only praying for the hungry, but feeding them. Knowing all this now, we have changed our pastoral prayer a little bit for this series. And we are asking that for you to participate in what we're praying for. And so we're going to pray for a specific group of people each week. And in that, then, we're going to give you some time afterwards to not only pray for those people, but then to ask God, how might you be a part of the answer to that prayer? What can you be doing throughout the week or throughout time eternal to address the need that you're praying for? We're calling it a responsive prayer. So we'll give you some time to do some listening too. And in your bulletins, you'll notice on the inside cover, there's going to be a part in each of these 5 bulletins that will have organizations that you can contact that will help you take a step into trying to be that answer. We have lots of great things happening here at Countryside that you can be a part of. And there are lots of organizations in our greater Omaha community that are doing amazing things. So I would ask that if you're looking for a place to start, contact one of these organizations. If you're already doing something to that effect, you could be starting right at home. You could be working particularly with a need in your particular family. You don't have to solve world peace. You have to ask God to be peaceful where you are. If everybody did that, world peace would be solved, right? How are you a conduit for peace? How are you making peace where you are? How are you nurturing, stewarding the earth? That's what we're going to be asking of you these next 5 weeks. To participate in our struggles, in our need, in overwhelming, unexplainable occurrences in life is what we are called to do because we are following Jesus' example in this. In the night in which he was betrayed, unexplainably and brutally, he chose life. He sat with his disciples and broke bread and said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And after supper he took the cup, and after he had given thanks, he gave it to all to drink, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, for you and for all people. For as often as you eat of this bread and drink of this cup, you do so in remembrance of me. And in so doing, you choose life, even in the midst of unexplainable phenomena, even in the midst of bad choices and consequences that seem inevitable. This meal represents the presence of God among us. You do not have to be a member of this church to participate in this meal. This is all about what God is doing. And we choose to participate in it. And you can participate in many different ways. You can either come forward, and if you do, you will pull a part of the bread from the loaf and dip it in the juice. And as you take it in, you are remembering that relationship with all of creation and how choosing life helps us go deeper into that relationship and live toward an abundant life in our community together. But if you choose to not participate, that's okay too. We ask that just being here with us, thinking about your relationship with God is presence enough. It's participation enough. If you'd like to participate from your seat, you can do that as well. Just raise your hand and our servers who are strolling around will come to you where you are. But we ask that as you come forward, or as you participate in any way in this meal, that you remember God's presence with you and how that transforms our ability to respond even in situations that we can't understand, trusting that the Spirit is there with words, with sighs that are too deep for words. Please come to the table. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Amen. I ask that the servers come forward and help us prepare this meal. Yeah? Yes. Very good.
Bread of Life, Bill. Bread of Life, Margie. Bread of Life.